We'd like to start our general session, our second plenary. And to do that, we have two panels that are going to be moderated by my colleague from the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services, Amy Bay. And so without any further ado, I'm going to introduce her and let her introduce our speakers and our topic. Amy?
Great. Thanks. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Okay, so while many assessment provisions remain unchanged under the ESSA, there's one very notable and super exciting change, right? And I'm sure all our panel can agree. And that is the requirement for states to submit evidence for peer review that its ELP assessment provides valid and reliable results, is aligned with the state's ELP standards, and is consistent with nationally recognized professional and technical testing standards. Any of you are familiar with the ELP assessment history of getting peer reviewed. It's a long and exciting, we're finally here. And so as this is a new assessment, I'm sure there's tons of questions and tons of interest in this, but this is a relatively short panel. We have two parts of the panel. We'll start with these first four talking about the general ELP assessment, and then we're going to shift to four other experts who are going to talk about the alternate ELP assessment. And each panel has about 40 minutes, which if you do the math, breaks down to about 10 minutes per panelist. So there's not going to be as much time for audience participation and discussion, but there are four sessions that are specific to the ELP and ELP assessments, and I'm just going to draw your attention to them. There's two sessions on validity evidence for the ELP assessments. They're both tomorrow. One is at 8:30 and one is at 2 in the afternoon. And then there's two sessions on the alternate ELP achievement standards. One is at 3:15 following this session today, and then tomorrow at 10:15. So I think there'll be more opportunities for discussion and audience participation in those sessions. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started with our first panel. We're going to focus our first panel on the general ELP assessment. We have four esteemed panelists, and I'll just go in order as I introduce them. We have Dr. Eric Zilbert. He is the lead psychometrician for the California Department of Education. We have Dr. Gary Cook. He is the Senior Director of Assessment for the WIDA Consortium and is a research scientist attached to the Wisconsin Center for Education Research. We have Dr. Margaret Ho. She's ELPA 21's manager for member outreach and support and outreach at Crest UCLA, working primarily in policy and procedures aligned with ELPA 21's strategic vision, including new initiatives such as the preparation for the ALT ELP assessment. And we have Phoebe Winter, who works with states and non-governmental education agencies focusing on bringing policy, psychometric, and practical perspectives to the design and implementation of educational assessment and accountability programs. Dr. Winter provides consulting to state departments and federal departments of education. Okay, great. So I'm just going to jump right in. Section 1 of the assessment peer review document addresses statewide systems of standards and assessment. So I'm going to start with Phoebe. Can you talk us through critical element 1.2, coherent and progressive ELP standards that correspond to the state's academic content standards?
Sure. The requirements for the form and content of ELP standards are quite different from academic content standards. So there are three provisions here. The law specifies that the ELP standards must be derived from the four language domains of speaking, listening, reading, and writing, and that the standards can be organized in an integrated manner or by domain, and that's something that I think has been clarified a little. The second one is that the standards must address the proficiency levels of ELs. Unlike academic content standards, ELP standards include the skills differentiated by proficiency level, and it makes it kind of interesting in terms of the type of evidence around technical quality that's needed, particularly when you're considering alignment and validity. Also, an interesting outgrowth of this is that the proficiency standards are usually written first, so the proficiency levels may not correspond to any particular achievement level once the cut scores are set, because that's not what they're written for. The most I don't know if it's the most different, but a very different thing is that ELP standards must align with the language demands of state academic content standards in reading, language arts, math, and science. A nice thing about this guidance is that alignment's further defined in the examples of types of evidence you can give. You can do demonstration, and here's how alignment starts to be defined, of a strong correspondence or linkage between the state's academic content standards and the state's ELP standards, such that the state can claim that language requirements outlined in the ELP standards correspond with the academic demands of the state's academic content standards. And I'm reading directly from the guidance here because I think these definitions are very important. The second way to demonstrate this evidence is to have a detailed description of the strategies the state used to ensure that the ELP standards, and here's the definition again, adequately specify English language knowledge and skills necessary to reflect the language needed to acquire and demonstrate skills identified in the state content standards. The third kind of evidence that can be provided is reports of an external independent review of the state's ELP standards. Again, that shows that the ELP standards represent that language proficiency required to acquire and demonstrate skills in the state content standards. So this alignment isn't new, this alignment requirement isn't new, but we haven't paid the kind of attention necessary to document it for peer review, I think, in the past. So we don't have very strong models or heavily researched models for evaluating or documenting the correspondence between skills required by the ELP standards and then the language needed to acquire content area, academic knowledge. And although I think that especially with the newer tests, some of that evidence is in the documentation of the development of the standards, so people can find evidence there, and the underlying theory that drives the standards themselves. If an external review is a requirement, though, and I'm not clear on whether it's a requirement or just one way to show it, we just really don't have a lot of the level of research that we've had into alignment of standards and items. The standards to standards alignment we don't have a lot in. I think the closest thing we really have some strong models in is the alignment of alternate achievement standards in the content areas to the content area, but still that's content area to content area. So I know that Margaret has been looking at this as well, and Gary has actually done research in this area, and the few models that are out there, one is one that Gary developed. So I'd like to give you a chance to jump in if you want.
Just that I think Phoebe's right. The issue is we've been playing around this, but because we haven't really had to do peer review, there's been really no rigorous organization and consistent putting together of all the knowledge. There are things like the ELPD framework that CCSSO published 2 or 3 years ago. But when you look at the ELPD framework and you look at early grades, there's some disconnect there. There are some alignment methodologies, but they really haven't been rigorously looked at across the country. There is some methodologies that we've created to look at the correspondence between academic content standards and English language proficiency standards. I mean, there's some things that are out there, but they really haven't been consolidated, and more importantly, they really haven't been submitted to sort of external peer review process. So I think there is material out there. I think there's a fair amount of material to support putting together, but there has really been no clear documented, argumented process for how to do this.
So the first state who submits their ELP assessment will be brave and blaze a path for the rest of us.
At 1.2, if you look in your document, you see those cute little dots, dotted lines and gray areas. I'm paying particular attention to the gray area for WIDA. But 1.2 for us consortium, I think we also have some skin in the game on that one as well, and trying to help states understand sort of the theory behind the development, the language development processes and the standards that you're adopting.
And so by skin in the game, Gary, you're talking about the hybrid. 1.2 is listed on the display in your document as being something that states will exclusively report on, but we're thinking that the consortia have a great responsibility to contribute to that particular element. So,
Thanks.
Thanks. And Phoebe, I'm not going to let you off the hook just yet. Can you talk us through the sections of the guidance that address including all students, including students with disabilities in the state's assessment systems?
Sure, and I'm going to talk first about 4.2, which is fairness and accessibility, and 5.3, which is accommodations. And I'm going to talk about them together, although they're not identical. But the requirements are pretty much the same for the academic content test and English language proficiency test in terms of providing accessibility tools and accommodations, making sure that students are able to take the test. But the actual tools and accommodations are going to differ, particularly the language supports. So the big issue here is that there are students with disabilities who are used to getting different kinds of accommodations or having access to different kinds of accessibility tools, and they're not going to get it on this test because it might interfere with the construct. So, for example, read aloud is most likely not going to happen for most students. So states really need to be careful and prepare in putting together something that will prepare students for the differences in the kind of testing conditions they'll have. And that's the big student effect there too. But they also need to be careful to not include supports or accommodations that are going to interfere with the construct, the communication constructs, and it's very different. You need to rely on, again, your theory underlying your standards, and also evidence, if you can get it, to determine what the acceptable accommodations are. The other kind of issue with this is that the literature on ELs with disabilities isn't strong. There's just not a lot out there. And the research in accommodations for English language proficiency assessments is not really there either, at least to the extent it is on the general assessment. So there are some things that are probably translatable, but in the meantime, states will have to spend some time thinking about how what's being measured affects how they need to interpret the literature that is out there and rely on best practice until we can do some more research in this area. And then 5.1 is a really interesting one. It's the one which is procedures for including students with disabilities. The major difference here between an English language proficiency assessment and a content area assessment is that a student can be exempted, that's not the word that's in the guidance, but can be exempted from being tested by items in one or more of the 4 domains if there aren't any appropriate accommodations for the domain. But the state also still has to provide an evaluation or a score for English proficiency based on what items they did take. So I'm not talking about domain tests because I think tests are going to be changing a little, but for example, a student might be exempted from the listening test. Deaf students and students who are blind are going to be most affected by this provision, but I think you can imagine that students with other disabilities might not be able to be tested with appropriate accommodations that don't change the construct. But that brings it down to defining the construct and what the construct is. So in determining, although students can be exempted, I think that since we are exiting students from the program based at least in part on their scores on this test, saying that yes, they have the language proficiency to acquire the knowledge and skills in the content standards, we might want to think a little more deeply about how that, and I don't know if this is legal or not, I'm just saying it. How exempting a student might tell us something different about the student than allowing the student, for example, to, if in the classroom the student has somebody giving, let's say, ESL in order to get the teachers talking, then aren't we interested in knowing whether that student has enough ESL knowledge and skills to benefit or to acquire the knowledge and skills in the content area classroom. That's just me. I know there are a lot of good arguments on the other side of whether signing, for example, is English. Or is it a different, we know it's a different system, but is it a different system to not qualify? Sorry, I'm going on a little too long. Let's see. And so the idea is if you combine, you have to figure out a way to give an overall proficiency score if a student hasn't taken a domain, and that needs to be related to your underlying theory of the test and not just willy-nilly thrown together. I'm sure we'll be looking at how that score is put together and whether it makes sense. You also have to have an appropriate interpretation of that score and think deeply about what that score tells you about the student.
Thanks. I think you started to go there, Gary, so I'm going to ask you to expand and talk about Section 2, the assessment system operations, and specifically critical element 2.1, test design and development.
So just taking off on what Phoebe had said, so behind the standards, there are several levels that are different. And if you haven't sort of parsed it from our conversations, what we're trying to do is communicate to you the uniquenesses of ELP assessments as opposed to content assessments, how they're different and what things to expect. Language proficiency assessments have 3 dimensions that we have to think about. One is domain, so listening, speaking, reading, or writing, or whatever combination of that those relevant elements you choose to select. Level, there at least need to be more than one. Often everybody that I know of in the country has at least 3. And then for lack of a better term, I'll just say topic. At least it has to relate to the language associated to language arts or reading, mathematics, and science. Now, there are several arguments about how you can identify the underlying language and construct of math, science, and language arts in one way. Do you have to do it separately? WIDA standards do it separately, UPA 21 doesn't. You just have to have an argument how you're going to identify that your items and that the development process includes all 3 of those dimensions, because all 3 of those dimensions are integral into supporting the development of an English language proficiency test. The other thing that's unique with this assessment, different from a content assessment, is this assessment is either providing or denying a constitutional right. So a student who is proficient on an English language proficiency assessment is basically at a point where the state chooses that they no longer require services that are a constitutional right for that individual student. So identifying what that proficiency represents relative to those 3 dimensions is really important. In the item development process, one of the things that you really need to do when you develop your items, when you document what you're doing, is how have you identified the breadth and depth of these 3 dimensions, both the linguistic complexity, the domain specificity, and I lost the third one.
Linkage to the academic.
Thank you, the academic language component. So those are the things that the item development process, when you develop your specifications, when you look at your specifications, I know UPA 21 and I know we have done it, I'm sure, and I know LPAC has done it as well. But these are the kinds of arguments when you think about your test design that you really need to think about. And at a minimum, you need to really represent in your development process for the items how all 3 of these elements are resident, how all 3 of these elements in the development process as well as in the item review and item calibration represent those 3 dimensions. Now, there are a variety of ways you can do it, and there's not one, and again, this is sort of the Star Trek undiscovered country. We don't know quite yet, but there's a fair amount of work that's been done to try and represent this. But those are the things that you really need to think about when you build these tests and when you look at the items in the development process of this test.
Great, thanks, Gary. Margaret, I'm going to pick on you now. This same section also addresses item development. Can you talk about how states can address the requirement that they use reasonably and technically sound procedures to develop and select items?
Sure, and thanks, Amy. In the statement on 2.2 item development, for those of you following along on this document, it's to assess students' English language proficiency based on your state's ELP standards in terms of content and language processes. And so I want to refer back to a document that Gary mentioned earlier, and that's the 2012 CCSSO Framework for English Language Proficiency Development Standards, corresponding to the Common Core state standards and the Next Generation Science Standards, an extra long title that in the biz has been referred to as the framework for a few years. So what are your items designed to measure is really the basis of this element. And if this is a useful resource for you, as it has been for many states, you look at it to see what correspondence might mean in this case, which is a little bit different than alignment has been traditionally defined for the content areas. And you can see that the writers of the mathematics and science standards identified key practices in their content areas, the things that students need to be able to do with language in order to fully participate in the content instruction in today's classrooms. And if you recall, the CCSS for ELA came out ahead of math and science, and so the writers were reconvened, and they also identified some key practices. There's some nice displays in that document that you might find useful. And when you look at that, they also implicitly demand that students acquire ever-increasing command of language in order to perform the knowledge and skills articulated in those standards. So to that end, the framework outlines the underlying English language practices found in those two big documents, the CCSS and the NGSS. And so it communicates to the stakeholders that the language the kids have to acquire, as I said, to successfully engage in instruction. So look at that very carefully, and then you can take a look at your ELP standards to see to what extent those ideas are reflected in the standards. So that's the first very important piece for item development. And then from there, we go on to test types or task types and how students will interact and respond to the information that's in there, and then to blueprints and so forth. But those specifications in the examples of evidence are not so different from what you are already familiar with for content areas. It's the underlying construct of what does the correspondence mean, and how are the content area language demands reflected in your standards.
Thanks. Just before the session started, we got a request to elaborate on this session that talked about validity, and I just wanted to remind everyone that there are 2 sessions, breakout sessions dedicated to validity. But Margaret, maybe you could just talk us through some of the highlights about section 3.2, the technical quality validity based on cognitive processes and linguistic processes.
Yeah, I attended that session this morning and learned a lot. I'm so glad they went before we're slated to go tomorrow afternoon. Which was a very useful applied discussion of the 4 typical validity emphases that might be reflected in peer review narrative or collections of evidences. But what we have here for ELP is that the intended language processes are appropriate for each grade level or grade band as represented in your state's ELP standards. And so it may be different for ELP assessments than for content assessments, that your test forms are designed to cover multiple grades rather than being very grade specific. However, you will find in your standards probably that your expectations in terms of PLDs, proficiency level descriptors, are state specific, and they should refer back to what I was talking about earlier, the content demands of that particular grade. That's very important that you keep that in mind. Even though you may have a test that, let's say, spans grades 6, 7, and 8, that you have clearly referenced the demands in grade 6, grade 7, and grade 8 for that test form.
If I could add,
Please.
the other thing to think about in section 3.2 is that dependent upon your standards, you have built a language acquisition theory on how the levels are differentiated. And so both the items and the arguments that you make for the assessment itself really should incorporate your theoretical background relative to those levels. So for example, and I apologize, I'm going to lapse in linguistic land for a bit, but if you have a cognitivist model, how are your items and how are the difficulty of the levels showing that difference? If you're a structuralist, if you're a functional model, how are your items and how is your test representing those levels unique to the language acquisition theory behind the tests and the standards that you've adopted? That's another different component of the English language proficiency assessment, because we're dealing with not just content relative language, but also the process that students go through in learning that language to the point where they're meaningfully capable of engaging in the content in the classroom where the language instruction is only English.
And typically those statements are in your theory of action, if you have one, or in your framework, if that's what you call it, or also you might find it in the front matter of your ELP standards. But that statement should reflect your state's core beliefs and foundational assumptions about English learners, about how they learn English, and your expectations for that group. So that's a really important piece to surface, Gary. And also, back to the CCSSO document, if you want to read more about a couple of the approaches that Gary described, there are two that are very well described. He described the second one, called FLAIR, and the first one, which focuses on a different approach, on functional as what you do with language, as well as the forms of language, was written by Kenji Hokuda et al. At Understanding Language. So those two kinds of approaches are there, and you can explore that to see if it's useful to you.
Thank you. Eric, I'm going to turn to you. Can you talk us through the areas of scoring and reporting, including Section 4 technical quality and Section 6 achievement standards and reporting?
Okay. So these things, of course, are inextricably linked. We're getting, to where sort of the rubber meets the road in terms of what we're going to say about the students. And that has to link the actual test they took, the score on the test they took, with the standards and how they performed relative to those standards. So you're building an argument that says, we took the items the students responded to, we aggregated and treated the information in this way, and then that led us to interpret the information according to these achievement descriptors that we've created that link firmly back to our standards, and then finally produce an intelligible score report for parents who are not often the best at reading themselves. So in the scoring area, of course, special to these tests, the fact that we are pretty much told we're going to have to measure 4 subscales. We're going to have to measure the 4 domains of listening, reading, writing, and speaking. And so we've got to start out from the beginning working to make those measurements. I think most of us have a 4-part test that does that. And I would say for most of you, you're kind of lucky compared to me, because if you're part of a consortium, a lot of this work in scoring and reporting will be done by your lead states and your contractors. For us, of course, we built the LPAC, the English Language Proficiency Assessment for California, from scratch by ourselves, and I've been in this process since the beginning and concerned about particularly scoring and reporting. So the technical report has to do a really good job of articulating how you went about combining or estimating the subscales and then coming up with an overall score. In our case, we have landed in a place where we're going to have two main scales that we estimate, one an oral, a listening and a speaking scale, and then a written, which is the reading and writing scale. This brings up kind of the problem that you have when you do real-world activities and you have one group on one hand who are extremely theoretical about English language development and have very high aspirations with respect to what the test can and should do, and on the other hand, you have to build a test that can be taken by students in a reasonable period of time. And all of this, of course, weighed down by the fact that this is a very important decision you may be making about the student, whether or not they're going to continue to receive services or not. So in our case, our standards are very focused on receptive and productive. But in the case of our tests, we have found that we can build the best, the most reliable and meaningful scales that are also the most useful for the majority of the population taking the test, which are very young students, as the oral and written scales that I've described to you. So we've got a lift where we have to make sure that we can, primarily through our achievement level descriptors, make that link back to the standards, right? So, for the scoring itself, all the stuff that you have to do for your regular assessments, you've got to make sure you document for these assessments. So you're looking at, checks on the machine scoring in terms of, the specifications. The specifications are followed. The items, result in the kind of results that you expect from the specifications. For human scoring, which is a very important component of this test, especially in the speaking domain, right? You have to do the kinds of things that you would do if you were doing something like scoring an essay, but it becomes more complicated because these have to be scored on site by usually teachers or test administrators in a district. We don't, at least on our test, record the students and score them centrally. They are scored locally. So we have to develop training materials and train trainers who go and train the actual administrators on how to score those. We have to do evaluations of those trainings that we would like to be able to submit in peer review. We're going to write the training materials. We're going to submit evaluations of the trainings. We're going to submit some rosters to show we actually held trainings. We're going to have to do some work where we have a program called RSVP. And RSVP means 25% of the schools in the state each year, something on the order of about 2,500, will send the results back to the contractor for scoring of all the areas, of course, except speaking. And we have to have some monitoring procedures to go out and see that that speaking scoring is taking place correctly. So once again, documentation of the achievement level descriptor development process is really important to say who helped develop those achievement level descriptors in terms of what their experience and knowledge of the panelists were, and then having good documentation of that process that you can share with the peer reviewers, because like I said, in my case, it's going to be a very important linchpin linking the actual score reporting back. In terms of score reporting, of course, we report scores in the technical reports. We report scores to the parents of the students. We have a separate system that reports scores individually in an aggregate to the school districts. And then we have interpretive materials that go along with all of this reporting, so that I think right now we're producing 10 different languages of score report interpretation materials, and are working at right now. I believe we produce English and Spanish score reports, but we'll be producing the actual score reports in additional languages as well. And you know, we submitted 10 different score report interpretations guides with our regular assessment materials. Just, you know, in the case of the constructed response items, I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned, you know, making sure that you have the kind of checks that you would have for an essay in terms of having test papers, in terms of having some method of back reading for any constructed response items that are scored by a machine, so you can ascertain how well the machine is doing compared to human raters. Every year I go through a list of items that are candidates possibly for changing over from human to machine scoring, and we look at a number of different statistics, particularly human-machine, the correlation between those scores and some other statistics. Kappa, I believe, is one of them. So let's see, did I have anything else to add? I think I got it.
Got it? Yeah. Okay,
Can
great.
I highlight something that,
Yeah.
that Eric said? So we, distinct from, I guess, the content tests, where many of the folks that have adopted sort of the speaking, listening part of their content assessments have yet to produce those. Language proficiency tests have been testing speaking since, I don't know, a couple thousand years BC. This is and so all of us have been assessing English language proficiency and speaking tests for a long time. It has yet to be required to us to show and to monitor and to support the reliability, the inter and intra-rater agreement of those who are scoring locally. So if you are a locally scored state, and we are schizophrenic, we can do both. The states that do that, there is a sort of a need to really identify whether the raters are scoring reliably, and the evidence that you need to support that is something that I think you just need to think about. And it's not an easy thing, and I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, and the resources available both in the state and the districts is very limited to do that. But that is something I am almost certain that the peers are going to be looking for, is evidence that if you're a local scoring state, the resources, and it sounds like Eric is setting up the LPAC to really support that, are in place, and you monitor and check the reliability of those locally scored speaking tests. And I'm sort of convicting myself now, but that's...
Oh, yeah, and so just on the standard setting for the ELP assessments, this, we've done ours already, and it was one of the more complicated processes I've gone through. Because, you know, you can't just use a simple bookmark process in order to do this. You have we actually had videos of speaking at different score points that people would evaluate in terms of a body of evidence type of approach in order to come up with how well students would have to do on the speaking to be good enough on speaking. Also because of the critical importance of these cuts, especially the one cut that is going to, in our state at least, refer a student for consideration to reclassification, we're doing some extra work in order to have as much confidence in this as we can. As a psychometrician, of course, I look at this data and I combine this data with our SBAC data, and I look at how those data compare. And I remember the first opportunity we had to have some EO students take our old test, the CELT. And I got the results for the students from kindergarten and grade 1 on the CELT. And it was breathtaking how much overlap there was between the English-only students and the EL students, like half the distribution or so. And so what you begin to understand when you look at these things is that there is not one right answer about how much is enough, right? How much support and how long is enough. On the one hand, my theoreticians with the language development say, you actually never finish being an English learner. You're always an English learner. We have 3 levels we talk about in our test. We have emerging, expanding, and then bridging. And I said, where's arriving? On that side, there's no arriving. Over here, though, we have to come up with arriving in order to do the reclassification. So a couple additional steps that we're taking is we're doing a comparative group sort of a study where we've had 100 teachers at each grade level actually assess the English language proficiency of specific students. And then at the end of this summer, we'll be taking a look at that data to see how well the teacher judgments align with the judgments made by the panelists. And then we will be combining that, at least for grades 3 through 8 and 11, with information that we get from the Smarter Balance assessments in ELA and mathematics to see how well our cut scores are placing the students relative to performance on that test. And you know, there's a lot of decision making that goes into this because you have to decide, well, is level 2 good enough, or do they have to be able to reach Met standard? But lots of English only kids don't meet standard. So where is the sweet spot? And that's why I keep coming to work, because this stuff's so interesting.
Thanks. So Amy, we were just discussing here on the side that one piece for the upcoming submission that you may not have clearly seen defined here is that for submission on ELP assessments, you're submitting on the summative only.
Yep.
The screener is not included, and so if you were worried about that. But there is a section here where you need to show that your screener is developed along the same lines as your summative, maybe out of the same item bank and that sort of thing. It has a relationship to the summative, but you're not actually submitting the screener.
Great, thank you for pointing that out. We have about 3 minutes left with these panelists, so I'm just going to let them briefly talk about maybe 30 seconds each, about the biggest challenges for states addressing these critical elements, knowing that we're going to talk about this more in our breakout session.
One word, monitoring.
I'm going to say ditto.
I think coordination among states that are using the same assessment, getting it in on time, getting it right.
I think the requirement to tie this to an underlying theory of language acquisition is something that we haven't done a lot of in the content area, or at least I know I haven't in the content area assessment. So I think that's going to be a challenge.
I do have one more comment. As a peer reviewer, and I know Phoebe is one as well, for those states who are submitting and for those consortia, and I should be pointing to me too, read what's in the document. Look at the examples. They're there for a purpose, and actually they're really, really good. So keep an eye on that, because I think one of the things that I find really frustrating when I do reviews is when we ask for things and we look in the document and it's like clearly in the example and clearly listed in the critical element and you can't find it. Just read it. It's all there.
And point to it, please.
Oh, that's another one, yeah.
There's another session on how to do peer review, but those are two very important things. You don't want your peer reviewer going, I know it's here somewhere.
And one thing I'd add from my experience with the other peer reviews, because we've done our alternate and the SBAC, is that when you have stuff that's limited, that you don't quite have enough, let them know that you're planning to do some more work. And also, you know, if you have something that's sort of difficult to explain, go ahead and explain it. Articulate, you know, why you did what you did. You know, if you have differences between your standards and the way you report, explain why those are the way they are and how they relate.
As exciting as talking about the general ELP assessment is, this is even more exciting, right? The alternate ELP assessment. So this panel is going to be talking about considerations for the alternate ELP peer review. And as I mentioned earlier, there are 2 breakout sessions dedicated to the alternate ELP achievement standards. And many of the panelists are on those panels as well, and they have agreed that if topics related to other aspects of the alternate assessment other than just the alternate ELP achievement standards are brought up in those sessions, they'll be happy to discuss. So again, we'll do a similar format as the last session. We have about 40 minutes, not as much time for discussion, but we hope you'll get a lot of great information out of this session. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel. Right beside me is Audra Amata. She is currently the Deputy Associate Superintendent of Assessment at the Arizona Department of Education. She was involved extensively in the National Center and State Collaborative, NCSC Consortia, including the development and implementation of the new alternate assessment based on alternate academic achievement standards. Adine Sato has more than 25 years of experience in education research and development, evaluation, training, technical assistant, and management. Dr. Sato's focus has been on making learning inclusive, accessible, and equitable, and her research, development, and consultation have affected practice and policy in the U.S. and abroad. Kim Brannon is the Director of Assessments for Special Populations at the Texas Education Agency. She has worked at TEA for almost 15 years and was recently promoted to Director of Assessments for Special Populations, overseeing Texas's alternate assessment, English language proficiency assessment, alternate English language proficiency assessment, and accessibility policy for all programs. And Dr. Melissa Golson is an educational research with expertise in fairness and testing, accessibility, and assessment of special populations. Melissa has experience in design and administration of large-scale state general and alternate assessment, as well as English language proficiency assessments. I'm going to start with Melissa. I'm going to start at the end. Considering this assessment is unique, needless to say, right, to the English language proficiency assessment, what else needs to, what do we need to consider that's different? So domain definitions, participation criteria, can you talk us through that?
Yeah, so what's new with alternate ELP? Well, everything that they said about general ELP pretty much applies, so I'm only going to address what is a little different. One of the first things I want to do is I want to go back to Section 1 and talk a little bit about how your peer review, as a previous peer reviewer, I have to say that when we've seen submissions that are really wonderful, the best submissions are always coherent in their system definitions around accommodations and different assessments. So what I would be looking for as a peer reviewer is some evidence in your TAMs or your participation guidelines. And so I, prior to this session, looked at many of your state participation guidelines, and there's no participation criteria established for alternate ELP assessments. So my practical approach from a state perspective is, what are you doing to identify the population? What is your definition for the population? What's the criteria for an English learner with a significant cognitive disability that would take an alternate ELP assessment? So that is a great place for you to begin thinking. And as you do this, I think that it'll lead you towards thinking about the design of the assessment and the test development. And so what would really be different is, as you're looking at test design, is what are the characteristics of this population that they bring to the table. This is a very diverse and unique population, so there's going to be a lot of considerations, especially domain considerations. So how you define or allow students with significant cognitive disabilities to perform reading, writing, speaking, and listening might be very different than you would have on a general ELP assessment. We've learned a lot from alternate assessment over the last 10 years. I think we could learn from looking at that research and seeing how our systems could be coherent. You want to have a design that's not going to totally have this population, when they sign in on test day, looking so different than what they're normally going to be instructed in. So you want to look at that instruction assessment connection. And around domains specifically, are there domain considerations where this student cannot perform in a specific domain based on their disability, such as if they are blind, whether they're deaf or they are deaf and blind? What does that mean? And that has implications for the validity of your assessment, how you're going to look at your composite scores, how you're going to figure out all of those things as you move forward in your test design. So one of the things that I think is really important is having a statement of the purpose of assessment. And in section 2, one of the things that you would do is be thinking about the purposes of assessment. So if your alternate ELP is only to identify students who should be getting services or classification for, or trying to set exit criteria, then that's very different than if you really are looking at not only do you want at the back end, if you backward design it, what do you want your reports to look like? What are the needs of the field? So recently, one of the investigations that we've had on the Altella project, and I want to shout out about that project, Dr. Lorraine Christensen at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's here, and we had an opportunity to observe about nearly 100 observations in classrooms with English learners with significant cognitive disabilities. So what are you doing to know the population? How are they being instructed? Well, one of the things that we see is there's a definite need in the field. So if you know that there are needs, then you really need to consider that in your design, and you want to inform the instructors or the teachers around what, when they get this report, what do they do with it? So we've assessed them, and now what? So I really want you to think about as we get, and what an opportunity it is to get this right. So I know the idea is just take your ELP standards and get this design done, but I think it's really critical for people to be thoughtful about this test design, because this is a very vulnerable population, and I don't want to see a student exited too soon, and maybe they really need English language service in order to transition into the world of work. And so those are real concerns that I have as we move forward with development of an alternate ELP assessment and the things that I think that are different. And then finally, I want to think about how you define language complexity for this population and what that means and how that might be different than on your general ELP assessment. And then last, when you're thinking about that composite score, I think that's really important to be thoughtful in your test design about if you are going to eliminate someone, like they can't take this, how does that impact the composite score, and what are ways to get around that so that you can build that accessibility in so that you are allowing students to actually participate fully in those domains rather than exempt them. So I think that it's a different philosophy, and I hope that we take that challenge as we move forward in development.
Thank you, Melissa. Adine, throughout the document, there's a lot of critical elements that speak to this assessment. And, you know, just speaking obviously more broadly, but what do states need to really think about as they begin to address these critical elements? And what do you think is the biggest challenge for states?
So I'd like to focus on 3 things. And in focusing on these 3 things, I'll be underscoring some of the points that Melissa raised, as well as some of the issues that were raised in the previous panel. The 3 things are the population definition, the construct definition, and accommodations. So with the first one, what do states need to do across all of the, most of the elements? There's an aspect that needs to be linked back to your population definition, right? So why are you doing things the way you're doing? What inferences are you hoping to gain from the measurement that you've developed? It all links back to who these students are. There's not a federal designation of students who are English learners with significant cognitive disabilities. So I would encourage states as a first task to be really clear on who these students are, what are their characteristics, as Melissa has raised, because that drives how you design your items, how you define the construct and expect students to demonstrate what they know and can do, given how they are instructed and how they demonstrate what we call listening, speaking, and reading and writing, because they've got assistive technology and augmentative and alternative communication devices that for an English learner and our expectations of knowledge and skills across the domains of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, it may look very different from what we're used to seeing. So the population definition is an evidence of how you've defined the students, what data you've used to define the students, the experts you've involved in reviewing your definition of the students and their characteristics. Those are some of the pieces of evidence that would be critical to gather, and they actually have a place across the various critical elements that you see in your guidance document. The second one, yeah, that was approval. Someone's calling and saying, good idea, Dean. The second one is the construct definition. So, and Melissa raised this too. So what is English language proficiency for our English learners with significant cognitive disabilities? As many of you know, they have devices that help them communicate, to express themselves. But they need to demonstrate knowledge and skills in listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So given your understanding of the student population and your definition of them, one of the next steps would be, what does listening, speaking, reading, and writing look like for the students? And then how do those expectations align with your English language proficiency standards for your regular assessment? And then the third one is accommodations. Because they do have tools to help or assistance, they need various levels of support to communicate and also to receive language. There's an issue of whether there's going to be some changes to the construct being measured, whether there's going to be some noise, some construct irrelevance. So the third thing that states would need to think through is what the accommodations look like and how that's going to affect the construct that's being measured. So those are the three things, and it's tied into the challenges that I see states face as they move forward. And I know that WIDA and Texas have thought through these as they've put in place and implemented their alt ELP assessments.
Thank you. Audra, I think we've been talking around this, so maybe we can talk specifically about data, how states can use their data systems to identify students and then to report to the department or use them within their states. And what are the challenges for states getting the best sets of data?
So first off, I want to say I feel like I was plopped from present to 2010 when we started our work on NCSIC, because these were the very conversations that we started with, was who are these students, what are their characteristics. So I've been able to be a part of other pieces of this development of an alternate standards or alternate ELP assessment. And so I'm really just leaning into the work that we did as part of NCSIC. And that was first to understand who these students were. And so we used in all of our states that began with NCSIC, the Learning Characteristics Inventory. And we took that data and really teased out all the different pieces. Part of that survey or questionnaire included expressive and receptive communication, where their instruction is where these students are being served. And so from that work, it's part of the work that I'm doing now in Altella, another survey was developed, and it's called the ICQ, and it's very similar to the LCI, lots of acronyms, but it's really learning who these students are. This information is all teacher reported, so that's one set of data that we have that's teacher reported. Once we got that in NCSIC, then we really dug deep into what does their instruction look like, and that's how we developed our task templates, which was to develop our items in the test. So I kind of bring that back to the alternate ELP and using those two pieces of data, an LCI and the ICQ, which digs a little bit deeper into the English language learner, kind of what language they're speaking at home and those kinds of things. Taking that and then further developing now items and assessment processes. Again, it amazes me to see all the correlations that we did with alternate assessment and then what we're doing with ELP right now. And so that's one piece of data. The other piece is that as states, we ask our LEAs to report students designated as an EL student. And when we look at that data, and I've been shocked to know not only NCSIC states, we looked at it through there, or now MSAA states, but we're also looking at it in other various ways. I think we have a session later on that really is going to show some of that data. there is a huge disconnect between what's being reported at the LEA level for identified students that also are a student with significant cognitive disabilities, and then what teachers are reporting in the ICQ or the LCI survey. And so I think this really just needs to go back down to communicating with instructors, with LEAs about what we're looking for, who are these students. I know specifically in our state, there's been a lot of myths, I'm gonna say, about these students, that because these students some of them, or many of them, are nonverbal or do not communicate in the same ways that other students do, they're not considered an EL student. And so really going back and understanding what perceptions are out there is really important. And I think the best way to do that is to use our data and show them, this is what's being reported in this data system through your LEA to the state, and then this is what's being reported by teachers. And I think Altella did a lot of work on that, and that's where it's really, really coming through. When we were first asked to get students for them to observe in Altella Project, we had a really hard time. We didn't know where to start to look. And so we went to those two data sources, and then we gave them some students. But when they went out there and they asked teachers just off the cuff, just, who are your EL students with significant cognitive disabilities, they had a longer list. So again, it's really going back and helping people understand who these students are, what the definition is of these students so that they know, and then using multiple sets of data to look at who these students are.
Great, thank you. So we can appreciate that states are in different phases of implementation. Some states and consortium have had an alternate ELP assessment for many years, and some states are either in the early implementation or development stages. So Kim, could you please talk to us about states going through the early stages, states that are just really starting this work, and some challenges that's going on?
Sure. Texas started the process about a year ago. I was looking over all my notes. It's nice to sit here. I'm taking my own notes because everything that y'all are saying is the exact same thing I have in my notes that we've gone through in the past year or so. We definitely started with who these kids are. We really looked at our tested population, so 3 through high school mainly, to get a basis of what we had. We looked at our alternate assessment students who are also identified as LEP, and we got a ballpark figure. In Texas, we have about 4,500 students with that label. So they're all disability categories, and we looked at how they were participating in our ELP assessment, and we saw that about half of them were exempt in all 4 domains, and then half of them were rated in 1 domain or more. So after we did that, we did a deep dive into our ELP standards and our proficiency level descriptors, trying to tease out, how we were going to assess these kids. That gave us an idea of some different assessment formats that we could use. We also have some special laws in Texas, specifically for this population, that teachers cannot be required to basically make their own assessment, meaning modify the materials to the extent where they're making it. So we didn't want to go to an item base, because for our general assessment, we have teachers given a 2-week preview window so they can braille things and put tactile, dots on images and things like that. So we knew we didn't want to go that route. The next thing we did, and we've done this probably 3 or 4 times and are about to hold another one in September, is get our educators involved at all levels, stakeholders involved, start the conversation. They created a theory of action, which goes back to what do y'all need from this assessment, and to start that conversation. And then we just finished at the end of April and the 1st of May our pilot test and COG Lab. We had about 2,500 participants for our pilot. And then our COG Lab, we went to 5 different districts. Like I myself went to 6 schools, 2 elementary, 2 middle, 2 high school, just to see what was going on. And some of the lessons we learned. Many of our teachers of these students were not bilingual or ESL certified because there's this common belief that their SPEDness trumps their ELness. So, and actually in our surveys, we got that response. The ARC committees determined they don't need the EL services because they're getting their SPED services. So we have that barrier to look toward, and that leads me to my next lesson learned is we need buy-in. Because ultimately it's for students and parents and teachers, so we need them to believe in what we're doing. The third lesson is we don't have the answer. We just have what's best for Texas right now at this particular time. I fully see just even in this morning ways that we can improve and move forward. It may not happen this particular year, but it will. With all the hope that we will continuously improve to help instruction for students. And I can tell you it's already working because just the fact that the conversation has been started between your SPED and your EL specialists is amazing. We've learned in our office that there's not one meeting that we have about this assessment that we have just SPED people or just EL people, because we speak very different languages. Just the vocabulary of what you instruct in the classroom is very different for those two specialists. So we've gotten very close in the office, a lot of teamwork. Our next steps, we just got, right before I came here, we got our data back on our items, and that was really interesting. We're doing a holistic inventory. We're calling them observable behaviors, where teachers make ratings on students' performance in authentic classroom activities. We've got a lot to do with teacher training. That's one thing that came out of the data. We don't think they really knew what we were asking them to observe. So we need to really hit hard that. Our idea is to have those educators and experts in the field come back and help us write real classroom examples that would show these behaviors, so it's authentic. And then maybe even make a repository to where other teachers can put what they did and build up different types of activities. So that, the reporting aspect, we need to work out. So that's where Texas is.
Great, thanks, Kim. And from someone who straddles an EL world and a special ed world, I really appreciate the conversation about bringing those two worlds together and having conversations across programs. I'm going to ask the panelists, I'm going to open this up to all the panelists to share, is there anything that you've learned in either the peer review of the alternate assessment for the content areas, or anything you've learned in developing the alternate ELP assessment that hasn't been shared that you want to share?
I would like to share one thing from the previous peer reviews that I've looked at, alternate assessments. As we move forward with alternate ELP, I think it's really important for me to give you this reminder. Having to make sure that you have grade level expectations for this population with well-defined and appropriate challenge for these students is very important, and that is critical to the development of an assessment. So as you are doing that, I have to say one of my concerns for alternate assessment in general and moving forward with alternate ELP is that vertical articulation. We should see a progression in the expectation for students at grade level. So if I look at a grade 3, it should relate back to that grade level target. But there should be a range of performance that is allowable, because this is a very diverse population. We have students whom I would think that maybe have been misidentified. Maybe they really know English, and because of their communication issues, they've been designated and they can never meet proficiency, so they're going to have that EL label forever. On the converse side, we have students that I'm very concerned about whom, because they're not behavioral challenges, or if there's a community expectation that the L1 is going to be okay for use, and you don't even give service to a student, how can you ever expect that they're going to learn English without any instruction or service? And then, so how are they viable in order to have college and career readiness skills in an environment where they're going to be expected to know English and or their native language. So really thinking about translanguaging for this population, I think is a good philosophy kind to think of, because we want students to be successful in their native languages with their parents and their caregivers, but we also want them to have opportunities. So I really think that it's really important that we keep the assessment on the domain construct and that we do not allow unrelated content to seep in, and that goes to Section 3 of the guidance. And for this population, a lot of educators do not see academic content or as relatable to students who are pre-symbolic. So having that performance definition at a level where it addresses that pre-symbolic level for this population is very critical in your assessment design. And so when I've seen great assessments for alternate assessment, there's great detail and attention paid to that so that you have that full range of performance for any student to be able to demonstrate what they are able to do at grade level expectation.
Mine may not be part of what I capture. I can't tell you what critical element it would be, but within the development process, I just caution people to think about the unintended consequences. One thing that we've seen is when you look at those younger kids, we have kids with non-categorical disabilities that are younger where they haven't quite figured out what disability they have, and putting this type of label on them that they take an alternate ELPA, we've gotten a lot of feedback that could potentially track them into a place they were never intended to be in the first place. So just keep all of those lines of communication and thought open to see that wherever you're going, it doesn't have those types of unintended consequences that you didn't really want in the first place.
And I wanted to highlight two things. The first is what Gary had mentioned, which is just the reminder that there was a lot of good thought put into the guidance and the examples represented in the guidance. And, but as a peer reviewer, it's not just a matter of going through and checking off the examples that are relevant to, in this case, the alternate ELPA. Yet, what I would encourage you to do is, and this came up in one of the breakout sessions this morning, is to think about the body of evidence in terms of a validity argument, and Ryan Kettler had brought this up earlier this morning. Because there's different levels of robustness for the pieces of evidence. And given that this is a fairly new area that we're all exploring and trying to figure out, there may need to be an additional type of combination of pieces of evidence to then present to a peer reviewer what's reasonable and a sound enough argument. So in addition to examining the pieces of evidence that are represented in the guidance, I would encourage you, and this is my opinion, not a federal mandate or anything, but in my opinion as a peer reviewer, put on a validity argument lens and really think about, are you presenting a reasonable body of evidence to support the claims that you're making, to support the critical element requirements that are in the guidance?
And I'm going to piggyback off of kind of what's already been said, but a couple of things. Number one, just we need to lean into the experts. I think what I've realized with this work is that there's a lot of expertise. There's a lot of things that we've learned about students with significant cognitive disabilities, and we have to lean into all of that work that's been done. And then all come together. I've been a part of some amazing work that's happened the last couple of months where we brought together the different consortia. We brought EL specialists, special education experts, and have really come with an open mind to really sit and discuss things in a way that I have not ever seen happen before. And I think that's really going to help us continue to move this work forward and be able to learn and continue to grow and come up with an assessment plan, whether you're a consortia or not, but sharing things and learning from one another. And also, I think one of the biggest pieces, and I think we've started some work on this, is really clearly defining communication and language. because for this group of students, this is where this gets really tangled up. And I don't even know that I clearly understand these two differences. I'm not an EL specialist, and I'm really leaning into, tell me what that means. What does that look like in your world? And then this is what communication and language means in the special education world. So I think if we can start off with getting a clear definition about those two pieces, then the rest of things will start to fall in place. And then finally, what I've learned about peer review, my experience was, submitting with NCSEC, and our philosophy was always, that's the end goal, is making sure that we've developed an assessment that meets all of the criteria. And maybe when we started, we didn't know what all that criteria was, but we had experience with peer review. And I think everything that we did, we documented from the very beginning very, very well. And in the end, we weren't searching for things and checking off things. We had our story. We had our message. We had everything that we needed. And I think that needs to continue to happen with the development of alternate ELPs as well.
Great, thank you. And for my last question, imagine I'm a state that's really struggling in this area, and I'm overwhelmed by the peer review guidance, and this is new for me. So what resources can you point me to anywhere that I can look or get help or reach out to any experts, just any resources you can think of? I'm going to open up to the whole panel.
I'll start off. Again, I'm going to say lean into the technical manuals that were developed in the alternate assessment consortium. I think that's where we got a lot of our work. We had a lot of information. There's a lot of studies done, vertical articulation and different things like that. So I think if we lean into those resources that were already developed, that can at least be a starting point for us. And again, I think for the first time, we're just seeing crossover of people working together. So I think if you're a state that has a current ELP assessment, lean into them. If you're a state that doesn't have one, there's Altella Group that, we're finishing up that grant work, but we're learning, we're new to this process, but we definitely are leaning on anybody that will listen to our story as well.
Yeah, so I had actually thought about this a little bit, and I'll just name a few. So WIDA and Texas have alternate ELP assessments, so maybe talking to them about their experiences and their processes. Altella, which is the Alternate English Language Learning Assessment, EAG, it's a grant-based project. They're looking at processes related to understanding the population, identifying standards, developing item templates and related RFPs, so they're another resource. The National Center on Education Outcomes, they've done a lot of work across states and consortia related to English learners with significant cognitive disabilities, English learners, students with significant cognitive disabilities, students with disabilities, so there's a wealth of information there. ELPA 21, I know, has started a theory of action in defining the population as well, so there's a group of states, as like WIDA, who have come together and talked about the population and the assessment. And the Council of Chief State School Officers is also working with their membership, trying to, again, get a handle on who these students are, what their characteristics are, and then what English language proficiency means for them and what it looks like. So there are a number of very active organizations and they've all been involved in conversations with each other, so I think there's a wealth of resources out there.
Yeah, Texas used all of those resources as well, reviewed. We also delved a little, I'm not sure of the authors at this point, I can bring them to breakout session D3 that I'm in, but on communication systems of students with disabilities, just to get a handle on all the different ways these students communicate. So that's really what we used, and definitely me and my team are willing to work with other people. We probably could lend you a few kids. That's what I hear the biggest challenge is getting a number of kids. So we have a plethora of students in Texas, so.
So I'm going to put my old state peer review hat on and think about, what you already have available that I don't see states using well. First of all, many of you have great TACs, Technical Advisory Committee members, who would be able to serve you well in the development and design of this assessment. Many times, you only involve the TAC after and then you want them to just rubber stamp what you've done. I have to tell you that that is a little bit late to do the right thing now approach. Because maybe you've already spent too much time doing something and your TAC is not going to be happy, but they don't want to say anything because you've gone down the road too far. So that's my practical number one thing. Use your TAC members before you make decisions. They can advise you around validity, and they are aware of these resources. Networking is very important. The other thing that I want to say about meaningful collaboration, a lot of times I do think meaningful collaboration, I love the word meaningful. What does that really mean, meaningful? To me, meaningful would mean that you are seeking out input in the development and design of your assessment, into your theory of action, not after the fact or post hoc of the development. So that means advocacy groups, inclusive of lots of agencies that some of us have, had to deal with in not so nice ways. It's so much better to bring them on board first. So inviting a wide variety of stakeholders to your development process, I think is a great way to get that initial collaboration and to build capacity as you move forward. Because I'm hoping that for this population, you have goals that are beyond whether or not you get a reportable score, but also how that's going to inform instruction and support student development of language proficiency as they move through school. And then last but not least by a long shot is you have the peer review guidance. It is amazing to me that you have this wonderful document with all of these examples and people wait until the end and do the mad dash of, I know we have this, we did this, where is this? So I would say if you're beginning, set you up a repository. Arrange it in the way that the peer review guidance is and start gathering your evidence as you design. It will make your life so much easier than going back years from now saying, oh, now we have to submit and we did this thing 2 years ago with meaningful collaboration. Where's that sign-in sheet? Who was at that meeting? Who reviewed this stuff? So from a practical gathering of evidence for a peer review, there are things you can do to be proactive. And so please be proactive because I know what it is when you're not proactive. So that's my practical. Can I have an amen on that? So it's a lot of work, but it doesn't have to be if you gather that as you go along. And the other thing is, if you gather it as you go along, you see where your holes are in your assessment design, and you may be able to be proactive and avoid some mishaps in a post hoc evaluation. So that's my recommendation.